And I will introduce our panel. I just want to say it's a great sadness for all of us that our friend Melinda Henneberger threw out her back this morning and will not be joining us. And that is a real loss to us all because Melinda is a wonderful voice on these matters. She combines deep faith with a wonderful sense of humor about life, and those are good. That is a good combination. But we have here a really excellent group of colleagues and friends, and I will just briefly introduce them. They are, you can see the slightly longer introductions on page 7 of your longer program. Krista Tippett is an award-winning journalist and radio broadcaster, New York Times best-selling author. She created the public radio program that many of you are familiar with, and everybody who isn't ought to be familiar with, On Being, which is a weekly exploration of, as they describe themselves, the big questions at the center of life. That gives you a very broad range to cover. Her books include Einstein's God, Conversations About Science and the Human Spirit, and Speaking of Faith, Why Religion Matters and How to Talk About It. So she will instruct us all on this today. Harold Meyerson is an editor at the American Prospect, an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. He is my colleague. He was previously the executive editor of the LA Weekly, and his work has appeared all over the place, including in the Atlantic, the New Yorker, and the New Republic. David Neff, next to Krista, recently retired from his post as editor-in-chief at Christianity Today magazine, which I think is one of the, if not the largest circulation religious magazine in the country, but it's way up there.
Yes. Except that during the last decade it went down there, you know, but it's coming back up.
A very important voice spiritually and intellectually for the American evangelicals. He continues to write his Past Imperfect column for that publication. He is also vice chair of the board of the National Association of Evangelicals. And Ray Suarez, to my left, is the host of Al Jazeera's American daily program Inside Story. He was previously at PBS's NewsHour, where so many of us were sort of instructed, enlightened, and often excited by his journalism, I have to say. He was also the host of NPR's Talk of the Nation. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Latin Americans. He also wrote a very good book about religious faith, and he was inducted in 2010 into the National Association of Hispanic Journalists Hall of Fame. I like the idea you're in the Hall of Fame. I'm going to begin with a general question, and I'm going to ask a general question because, and I told the panelists this at the outset, and I'll start with Krista, and we'll do that side and then this side, because I want each of them, journalism and culture and the common good is a conversation that could go in a lot of directions. And so I wanted them to put sort of at the center of the discussion what they think should be at the center of the discussion. And I go to Krista first because of her expertise on big questions at the center of life. And the two questions are connected, which is, what can journalism do to serve the common good? Or is it journalism's business to serve the common good? Is that even a proper definition of what the role of journalism is? And so I'll start with Krista.
You know, I think when you phrase questions like that among journalists, they do sound suspect. I think that you open yourself to charges of, are you talking about advocacy journalism? What I would point out, to me, there are many ways to talk about journalism serving the common good, and the problem of polarization came up in the last panel, and I don't want to go down that road. Maybe we will. To me, the larger issue is that the profession of journalism, like most of our professions, is finding that the forms and philosophies and approaches that worked in the 20th century don't work so well in the 21st. And news has traditionally, in terms of how we understand it in modern terms, has been defined as the extraordinary things that happen today. That's what makes the headline. And generally, we have accepted that as generally the extraordinarily terrible things that happen today. But in a world in which we are bombarded from every direction 24/7 by the bad news, and then we get the same bad news from 10 different angles, the effect that this has on us is to internalize the bad news, not as the extraordinary thing, but as the norm. And this does not serve the common good. I do absolutely believe that most journalists, that the spirit of journalism, that journalism is a mission-based profession, that there is absolutely, in most of the journalists I've ever known, certainly in my own career, this desire to serve the common good. But the ways in which, again, that worked previously, it doesn't work anymore. But again, that question is suspect. Well, so am I saying that journalists should nourish hope? Am I saying that journalists should serve the common good? You know, again, it's called, are you talking about advocacy journalism? But I would point out that when people ad nauseum cover earthquakes and school shootings, they are not accused of being advocates for earthquakes and school shootings, right? Now, I'm better at diagnosing this than I am at outlining the solutions, but I think that there needs to be a period of reflection and appraisal and discernment within our profession. I thought there was a very telling image that Alice McDermott presented yesterday. I don't know how many of you were there. She talked about being interviewed by a journalist who was skeptical about her faith, and in particular her faith that there is such a thing as the common good. And Alice said, yes, I do believe that. And the journalist leaned back, and we can all picture this. We've seen this many times, and said, what about the psychopaths? And the truth is, journalism as we know it, and not just the strident journalists, but traditional journalism, is fabulous at covering the psychopaths among us. And I would just, you know, I'll say one more thing and then hand off. And journalism has also been terrific at covering the psychopaths in our religious class and in our religious life. This does not serve the common good. There are many, you know, religious traditions themselves, common people themselves need to become better communicators. But I think that these are some of the issues I think journalists and the entire profession, not just journalists, but editors and owners of media outlets, need to be in discernment about.
I was thinking about the tweet that could come off what you just said, and it would be something like, journalist accuses fellow journalists of being obsessed with psychopaths. And something in what you said just reminded me of a news executive many years ago who was trying to defend himself against charges of bias. And by mistake, one might say, charitably, he said, we don't report the news from anyone's perspective. We report the news from no one's perspective. Which is, I've pondered that for many years. David, where would you take us?
I don't think anybody becomes a journalist to become rich, and so you really do have to be mission-driven. But I've often used the image of the mirror and saying that whatever community, and every publication, every journalistic enterprise serves a particular community. It's not the whole general public. Whether that's people who demographically fit NPR, or evangelical Protestants, or people who live in a particular city, or whatever. It's important for journalists to hold up a mirror to that community of discourse, and show both the positive and the negative things that are going on. And I think that that is an important function for the common good. It's like when I stand in front of the mirror in the morning to get ready to go out, I have to make certain adjustments. And communities make adjustments because reporters both report the negative stories that community institutions have been misbehaving in one way or another, or hurting people in one way or another. But similarly, when journalists report the positive things that are happening, the innovative things that are happening as people are meeting various challenges in their community and providing models that can be replicated, that's a wonderful thing for the common good as well. So it's that function of the mirror that I think is the basic image I would use, the metaphor.
And do mirrors serve the common good?
They do.
A direct answer. Ray, where would you take us?
Well, I think when I was growing up, there was a more durable notion of what the common good was, because there was a more easily identifiable consensus culture. So that if you picked up Life magazine, or you picked up Look, or Time, or Newsweek, or Collier's, or the Saturday Evening Post, there might have been a slight variation in political stance, but there was a generally held understanding of what was good about what was happening in the world and what was bad about what was happening in the world. And out of that consensus culture, we've moved in 50 years to a customizable information culture that is as individual as a thumbprint. So talking to an audience that I do every day about what a common good is has become a really daunting, difficult thing. To propose 40 years ago or 50 years ago that it would be better for more people to have health insurance than less would have been it would be almost nonsensical, because it would be such a commonplace observation. Like, why would you need a journalist to even codify that idea? Of course it's better for more people to have health insurance than fewer. To propose that it would be desirable in a society for more people to have the wherewithal to have a sufficient nutrition day by day, would be better than fewer people able to do that, would have been an unremarkable and almost preposterous proposition a half a century ago. Now it's one that's actually open to debate, because there is no widely enough held sense of the common good that I'm talking to people who know the same things about the same things, and all they may disagree about is means and ends and what those means would look like. Now everything's up for grabs, which makes the job of a journalist talking to this mosaic tile society rather than this smooth plaster wall society. It makes it a really, really daunting prospect. I go to work every day convinced that I'm helping serve the common good, because as a journalist, I define the common good as more people knowing more things about more things in order to create a coherent vision for themselves of the society that they live in, exist in, and operate as a citizen in. So I may define it in a different way. Maybe I've had to retreat to that definition, but to me, that's the common good. If more people understand how the world they live in works, then they'll make decisions as citizens that, in a Ouija board kind of way, will get us to some sort of common wisdom.
I like Ouija boards at a Vatican co-sponsored event. I wanted to just press you before I go to Harold on that, which is, it does seem to me that journalism is, in a way, the quintessential Enlightenment profession, because all of us assume in what we do that somehow more knowledge, more understanding leads us to something that might look like the common good. Is that actually an accurate assumption now?
Well, we all come through the front door as idealists, and we may go out the back door as cynics. I hope I can hang on to my idealism, and really, I do believe that more is better when it comes to knowledge and understanding. And even now, 38 years in, I still believe that, from the day I first took a paycheck in a newsroom as a copy boy. Once I stop believing that, I think it'll be very hard to do my job, because the real conclusion would be, what's the use? And frankly, there are days when I look at what passes for news and I do think, what's the use? We can't even agree that up is up and down is down, that the sky is blue, that the ocean is warmer today than it was 20 years ago. I mean, we can't agree on basic measurable things, and that's a very tough, when everyone's standing on their own island in this endless archipelago, it's hard to do anything but shout at each other from the sandy shoreline rather than talk on common ground.
Keep the faith. And Cardinal Rovazzi will appreciate the island reference, which he focused on earlier. Harold is my friend and colleague as a columnist, so I can't resist sharing at this point. One of the things I like about Pope Francis, which is he's one of the only Pope I know of who attacked political pundits like us. Pope Francis said, if one has the answers to all the questions, that is proof that God is not with him. And so I think that's a sort of slap in the face to people who have to do what Harold and I do. Harold,
that's a hell of an introduction.
It is. But I share your sin. So anyway, go.
Great. Okay. I think Ray has touched on one of the serious problems for people like us, and that is our growing crisis of faith in empiricism, which is to say there's a good deal of research going on right now that shows that people are predisposed to accept facts that confirm their worldview and predisposed to dismiss facts that don't. This is perhaps emblematic of what goes on in a country with rifts as deep as ours right now. And I think it creates for people like myself and EJ and Ray and people who are, as EJ and I are, explicitly opinion journalists, the question of how much do we want, let us say, our columns in the Post to, inform the people who share our beliefs. How much is it argumentative and trying to woo over the elusive people in the middle? How much do we really want to excoriate the people we think are completely wrong about issues? These are issues that EJ and I deal with, I suspect, I know in my case, I suspect in EJ's case all the time, though EJ is a gentler soul than I as a columnist. I think when you come at this the way I do, which is, again, as an opinion journalist, the whole question of common good is one that, in which you start with the kind of beliefs that Ray articulated, that by putting out the information you have, you are serving the common good. But that also there are some real divisions, and you need to call out the ideas you think are wrong. I would be happy dealing not so much with the common good as with the greatest good for the greatest number. I'm with John Stuart Mill on that. I would be very happy with Occupy's formulation of the 99% and the 1% in describing the American economy. 99% is good enough for me in describing a universe that I think needs to have its needs, its problems articulated. Not necessarily its beliefs, because I think the clarification of the needs and problems, because I write a lot about economics, are the kind of contribution I can make to the common good. But we are in this segmented society, and I have to say that as an advocacy journalist, a lot of what I do is trying to make the best case for the set of beliefs that I think will lead to the common good. But I mean, look, as Ray pointed out, you would think you are addressing the common good in the greatest sense when you are talking about the perils of global climate change. Global climate change does not discriminate. It's the same air, it's the same heating, it's the same cooling, it's the same proliferation of storms that affects the believers, the non-believers, the rich and the poor alike. So when you talk about measures to combat global climate change or mitigate it, you would think you're serving the common good. Yet this is contested up one side and down the other. You do the best you can, but you do not expect on any issue that I know, except, well, with one exception I'll get to in a minute, you do not expect agreement. I think my sort of lowest common denominator sense of what the common good should be in journalism at least deals with rules of engagement. There are some arguments you make, there are some arguments no one should make that get made all the time in certain media. But my sense of my sense of where I think we should be constrained deals with mode of argumentation more than anything else.
Thank you so much. I want to pick up on that. I also want everybody to feel free to jump in harshly or warmly, however you see fit as people talk. But all of you in different ways, I think, have put on the table a question that sort of I raised in the previous panel, which is the whole nature of argument and dialogue. And it strikes me that even though, again, Harold and I are kind of in the argument business, a lot of what we have now is nothing like argument. And I think it goes to Ray's point about not even sharing a common ground of fact. And it's very hard to have a real argument if you don't share a common ground of fact. But it's also that there is in our culture right now, our political culture, a remarkable reluctance to even entertain someone else's thoughts, take them seriously. Krista, you try to do that all the time on your show. So why don't you model this for us?
Well, what I want to say is I think it's important not to equate the common good with common ground. And if we say that we can't have common good if we don't agree on certain visions or directions or facts even, I mean, it's hard. It is a little bit crazy that we can't agree on facts, but there you go. But to say that media should nourish the common good, that would be, for example, creating models of disagreement, which is not about demonization. It would be about nourishing hope, which would include, going at the stories of human resilience and progress with the same kind of sophisticated, nuanced, robust reporting that is given to, the school shooter. Putting that kind of information, because the effect of so much of media, and again, I'm coming back to my kind of basic point, the effect of so much of the way media functions now in our daily lives is to demoralize and paralyze people. Mm-hmm. And if media, and again, this doesn't have to be about what message it's sending or whether it's getting people on the same page, but if it is nourishing a different kind of listening, of grappling with issues, of encountering disagreement and working with disagreement, that would also nourish the common good.
I think, first of all, I think it's a great distinction, common ground, common good. Second, I've known Krista for close to 30 years, and I've always thought she should be a pastor, and I think she just made that point, although she kind of has an electronic...
We can tell about each other.
We do indeed. That's sort of an electronic church you run in a way. David, you wanted to come in on that?
Well, I think modeling a proper kind of argument is something that can be done. I can cite an example from my own history where the evangelical community was being torn apart by a particular theological discussion, and editorially our team was pretty convinced that one side was heretical, but they were being completely misrepresented in the way people were talking out on the web.
Briefly just give an example of what's in your head when you say that, if you don't mind.
There was a small group of theologians, evangelical theologians, who were categorized as the openness of God theologians, who believed that, God didn't know the future was completely open for God. And, our team was pretty much classical Christian and Orthodox on that question. But because they were being attacked for things that they didn't say, didn't hold, they were being smeared, I tried to create a situation in the magazine where the two sides could talk to each other in the best possible way.
How did that work out?
The two sides got a book published together.
That's...
because they had far more material than we could put in the pages of the magazine. But
form of happy ending.
It's a form of happy ending. Yeah, that's right. But by and large, we've tried to find various ways to model that sort of discussion. As a matter of fact, we recently, shortly before I retired, created a discussion feature in the magazine that required 3 responses rather than 2, so that it wouldn't fall into a bipolar kind of thing. And we would frame the questions in a way that could not be answered yes or no, so that we were thereby, creating the kind of argument where people would get beyond, I need to identify as a yes or a no.
I am contemplating, from what you said, the creation of a Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith blog in the Catholic Church. It would just be a fascinating concept. Let me pick this up and let me throw, if I put it that way, another log on the fire, which is I think one of the things that characterizes American politics in general and also the culture is a change over the last probably 20, 25 years in the way in which we talk and argue about religion. And I have something very specific in mind. Not that we have not had religious divisions in our history. We've had enormous hatred and anger across religious lines. There were riots in Philadelphia over which version of the Ten Commandments should be taught in the public schools. So we take these religious questions seriously. But I think you've seen an almost what I could call a Europeanization of the American discussion, which is to say the rise of two things at the same time. On the one hand, the rise of evangelical Christianity, the spread of evangelical Christianity, that has been accompanied by the rise of what you might call secularism or disaffiliation from religion. And that's created a different kind of conversation and a certain kind of polarization in the way it's described. Let me throw it to both of you. I'll start with Harold on that.
Well, I'm the representative secularist up here, so much so that I never really had anything to disaffiliate from. And yeah, I think there is, overlaying that, there is the political complication that the best efforts of some of us notwithstanding, the evangelical impulse has been politically identified on the right, the secular sort of a little more mushily on the left, but so it's really kind of two rifts that imperfectly overlay each other. And that I think complicates the dialogue and issues of individual rights, issues of can you have same-sex marriage and so on, become part of a political dialogue, again overlaid on religious questions. It's which is makes for I think a harsher and more intense form of polarization. I think the great value of Pope Francis, and EJ knows that I am, the de facto head of secularists for Pope Francis, is a sense of clearly a willingness there to not so much, by no means abandon beliefs, but encourage a broader sense of a courtyard of the Gentiles, and even a courtyard of the gentles, which is what I was about to misspeak. That that there is this a greater openness to this kind of dialogue. I think also, there's a third dimension in which the evangelical secularist polarization exists, and that is, to a certain extent, I think, a polarization of class is overlaid on that as well. So there are all kinds of factors then that come into this, that you're not only evangelical, you're, this hayseed, is a factor in that dialogue too. So I think you really have three dimensions to that polarization, which just creates greater antagonism, unfortunately.
I just want for all of you to know the spirit of Harold's beliefs. It's one of the best phone calls I will ever get. My wife was ill. She got better. I pick up the phone, and it's Harold after I come back from the hospital, and Harold says, this Jewish atheist finds himself praying for your wife, and I'm not supposed to be praying, so tell her to get well quickly. And I will always love Harold for that phone call. Help us on this.
What's been changing since the Second World War, we came roaring out of the Second World War with a sort of deist consensus where interconfessional differences were sort of elided and made blurry, so that Dwight Eisenhower, who was born and spent his early life as a member of Jehovah's Witnesses, could have not been baptized until after he became President of the United States, and nobody made too much of a big deal about it. He never talked in any specific way about God, about the content or denominational content of his faith. He, like Congressman Wolf, who mentioned it earlier, is a Presbyterian or became one later in life. And this was a time when if you mentioned religion in politics, it was more likely to be accusations from the right that religion was getting too much involved in left-wing politics, whether it was the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, issues of wealth and poverty, rather than the flip side argument that we hear these days that religion is getting too involved in right-wing politics. The bizarre paradox is that particularism, and I think David touched on it when he talked about this tempest inside evangelical world, particularism is rising even as the fastest growing faith group in the country is none when you ask them for their religious affiliation. So one...
That's not N-U-N either.
Right. N-O-N-E. And it's right now roughly 1 out of every 5 Americans, or 60 million people, an entire Britain, an entire Italy inside the United States. It's not a small or inconsiderable number of people. And as religious fights and fights over nominally religious things happen in our public life, they're very little heard from. They often just shrug their shoulders and move on because they just don't get what the fight is about. It's all something that they're not part of and wish heartily that there was a lot less of in American life. So if politics is war by other means, or war is politics by other means, some of these arguments are religion by other means, where you choose up red shirts, blue shirts, shirts and skins, gold team, red team, whatever, and have a proxy war over things that you don't want to really talk about what you're fighting about, but you're fighting about it nonetheless, just under other cover. I find it fascinating, frankly, and as I watch nervously as that nun figure rises, unlike Harold. My daughter is a seminarian, and she'll be ordained in a couple of years into a world where she is not speaking to a consensus culture that thinks more religion generally is a good thing, but one that's openly questioning whether any religion is a good thing. And so she's going to have a tougher marketplace to work her service and her professional life in.
And just to underscore that, as one of the speakers mentioned yesterday, among Americans under 30, 35, the number of nuns is about 30 to 35%. So this is a sort of sharply growing, in a way, younger generations earlier were not this disaffiliated. So I think that's very important. Krista, talk. By the way, we will have Q&A here. I was instructed in the first panel that we hadn't worked out Q&A with the members of Congress, but you will be able to talk back to the media during this discussion. But Krista, I'd like you, apropos of this, to talk about the change in the name of your show, because I think it was very revealing of what we are talking about here and the thinking that went into it, and perhaps that can sort of throw some light on this.
It's obviously a long story, but my program was called Speaking of Faith for the first 7 years. And what I really wanted to do, starting that show, was to open up imaginations about what faith is and who people of faith are. The program itself evolved. You know, we were speaking less about faith than I was speaking with people of integrity and talking about how their religious questions and insights and practices infuse their lives doing all kinds of things. So it wasn't really speaking of faith, but we did find over and over again that the word faith itself was an obstacle. You know, it's a meaningful word for many people. It was alienating for many people. And we have many, many atheists and agnostics among our listeners who actually want to be part of these discussions about moral imagination and the things we talk about under the rubric of faith. And so changing the name to On Being was creating a more hospitable welcome, I would say. But also something that I care deeply about is getting faith out of its compartments, right? That faith is not in a box, and also that it's not just about beliefs, which is how it tends to be covered in journalism, right? What do they believe versus what do these other groups? But it is essentially this part of life at its most interesting and vital, it is about who we are and how we live. And those are the people I want to be talking to. Now, it's also evolved into, I talk to a lot of physicists and scientists who are not themselves religious, but who are making theologically and spiritually relevant and evocative discoveries. To the nuns, I want to say also, I find that the NONES, if you really break down those percentages, a very small percentage of them who identify as atheist. They're not full of certainty. There's a lot of seeking, there's a lot of theological inquiry, and there's a deep commitment to service. There's a lot of ethical inquiry. And I personally think that the nuns may be a force for spiritual renewal for our traditions as we move through this century, kind of reminding our traditions of what this is all about. Like so many people these last couple of days, the nuns also tend to be great fans of Pope Francis. Yeah.
By the way, she called the show On Being because Courtyard of the Gentiles was already taken. So it's a because
it rolls off the tongue.
In many ways, in a lot of ways, that's what you're doing. David, it was interesting when Krista was talking. I'm going to ask one more question, then open it up. You were nodding in agreement with her, or at least you appeared to be nodding in agreement to her assertion that the nuns and the seekers may actually be a gift to religious traditions. Maybe I misread your nod, but maybe you can take it from there.
But I would agree with Krista there, but that means that the people who run religious institutions need to probe that very carefully to find out how to make their borders permeable and yet definable. And that is very hard for people who run religious institutions.
Say a little more about that. That's interesting.
We have an argument within evangelicalism about whether we are a bounded set or a centered set community. And I've been one who's argued that we are centered around certain things, but we don't have very well-defined boundaries, as long as we're, But there are those in our community who are constantly wanting to draw the boundary as a distinct, separate enterprise. And you can't find a source of renewal in people who are seeking if you keep drawing boundaries so much as operating with kind of a centered set mode of thought.
Looking at Harold, I was thinking of why the word sectarian gets applied to both religion and the left, because that argument sounded very familiar. The last question I asked before I open it up, although I reserve the right to come back. One of the problems for journalism in covering the religious life is that journalists run into two essentially contradictory, or at least as I see it, contradictory lines of criticism. On the one hand, secular journalism especially, this doesn't apply to David so much, is accused of ignoring religion, failing to see its importance in people's lives, in public life. We will cover sports and business and all kinds of other things far more than we ever talk about religion. However, on the flip side, many people within religious communities get very angry when we do cover religion in ways that reflect badly on religious institutions. And I've always wondered if there were any, I mentioned the Peace of Westphalia, are there any articles of conciliation on these two questions, on these two poles? And Ray, you've covered, one of the reasons I'm glad you're here is that you paid more attention to religion over the course of your career than a lot of other people in journalism have. And I suspect you've pondered this question a lot.
And EJ, you define it exactly correctly, that they're glad to have the gaze, that is G-A-Z-E, until the gaze becomes too intrusive, and then it's persecution. And that's a tough line to walk, because if you're a reporter who, as I do, believes that religion is a big shaper of our common life, for better, for worse, daily, the idea that go this far but no further is a little ridiculous. And sometimes just fairly commonplace observations about the life of religious institutions get the accusation, a backlash accusation, that you're being biased or persecutorial when all you're doing is inquiring. I was a reporter in Chicago when the Archdiocese closed many of its inner city schools. And in my stories, talked about how many of these schools were running massive losses year after year, and that the church deserved a great deal of credit for keeping so many of them alive as long as they did, that they were performing a really valuable ministry in some of the toughest neighborhoods in America. And just by the fact that I was covering what was a quote-unquote bad news story for Catholics, got letters accusing me of being anti-Catholic when all I was a reporter. That's what a reporter does. You consider the best and worst parts of what's happened, and you try to explain the sum of it all to an audience that may have very little personal insight into what's going on because they don't go into the inner city, or the kids don't go to Catholic school, or so on. So there's a funny relationship between the broader marketplace of readers, listeners, and viewers and our efforts to cover religion as motivating institutions inside our society. And certainly during the priestly sex abuse problems of the last 20 years, as the news business has been a party to peeling away some of the more tawdry parts of that story, the accusations have come thick and fast that it comes out of an anti-religious sentiment, that it comes out of an anti-Catholic bias, when really it's nothing of the sort. It would be an almost criminal misuse of our newsrooms to ignore a story like that. It would be an almost criminal misunderstanding of what we exist for in society to have ignored that or played it down. And it's one of those times when believers have become quite uncomfortable in many cases with what the news business was doing.
Harold? David and Harold?
I wanted to say, but I think a lot of believers are grateful when their institutions are held accountable. Frankly, there's a lot of enterprise reporting that has to go into something like what the Boston Globe did with the sex abuse scandal. But weren't Catholics nationwide fundamentally grateful when that was over, that we are faced reality that the people that we know who have suffered at the hands of certain clergy are beginning on a healing process now?
I mean, my hunch, and I haven't seen polling on this, is that it might be divided into three camps. A very significant camp that was purely grateful, another significant camp that was grateful but worried that did the church get overcovered relative to other institutions where abuse happened, and then a minority that said, you're picking on us. And I think that, those first two groups together are, I'm quite sure, a majority. I don't know what your sense of it is, but I think that's...
And my sense is that reporting can be kind of a blunt instrument at times, and so at the time that all of that was coming out, I was grateful for wise observers like Peter Steinfeld wrote some excellent pieces trying to help us identify, where were the real villains,
Right. Krista, do you have anything on this? And then I want to open it up.
No, let's open it up.
You don't want to touch that one, huh? Father over here, we have a mic, and then the gentleman over here on the left.
I thought I was in disguise. I'm Gerald Fogarty. I am a Jesuit. I'm professor of religious studies and history at the University of Virginia. But
So
I belong
how
to
did
the
you, Father? I'm sorry.
Oh, that's right. That's Now, one of the things I'd like to pick up on it, that thing in particular, I got advance news about the breaking news that was going to be in Newsweek originally. And I got a call the Thursday before. They said, has the cardinal ever been deposed? I said, no, but one almost was. The Cardinal Archbishop of Boston in around 1920, William Henry O'Connell. So as soon as it said Boston, they told me the rest of the story, so I started preaching on it that Sunday in Charlottesville so that people would be aware when it came out 2 days later. Anyway, so I agreed. Now the thing is, I was once in a restaurant discussing this, and I got attacked from another somebody in another, what do you call them, another table anyway. He turned around and said, if you want to criticize my church, you can get up and leave. He was part of the problem. So I don't want to get off on that any further, but I have, Ray, you mentioned that there was a post-war World War II consensus, and I agree. It began really in the years just before the war. I'm working on that right now. And then what happened was the pacifism, or the within the churches in the 1950s, then it started to come out again, and then the same thing that divides the American society certainly polarizes the American church today. The one thing I'm grateful for as a historian, I want to see how popes work out. I defend the papacy, but not the individual occupant. I mean, this guy's new. But one thing he's done for me, at least, is nobody can say, and that's a Jesuit. So at least now they can't say it. They said that about Georgetown, by the way, constantly. Now, you were talking about argument, and only yesterday, Brian Hare brought up the issue of John Courtney Murray, a famous Jesuit theologian from the 40s through his death in 1967, who was the shaper of this Vatican II's document on religious liberty. And he loved to play with phrases. He talked about a religious conspiracy, a breathing together of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews for the common good. Sort of what we're talking about. The other thing was used the phrase being locked together in argument, shaping the public policy, because he said to make religion private, again he played on a word, is idiocy. He played on the Greek word idiotes, the person who has no responsibility for the common good. But now a question out to everyone there. I have a problem with the notion, I know the nuns, I keep fighting with our campus ministry people, they don't realize, and over 40% of our students are Catholic at the University of Virginia. My estimation is that less than 400 go to Mass. Most of them are becoming nuns. They're dedicated to service, but the Catholic University's response is a group called Focus, which is very fundamentalistic to my experience. They ignore me completely. But one of the things, well, they don't, it's non-academic. But anyway, I wonder if you could address any of that, the notion of service, and if you can look at CARA, the Center for the Applied Research in the Apostolates, they did a study of the Jesuit Volunteer Corps of the class of '97, some 10 years later, and found that most of them thought the Catholic Church meant service. Sacramental life? No. Belief? No. But anyway, maybe somebody could address that, or maybe we could discuss it later. Who? The microphone. Oh, there you are.
I'm going to assign you, Harold.
You are?
I am.
Okay. Well, you know, my experience is there are huge numbers of young people on campuses who are committed to service. I would say most of the ones I know, because of the circles I travel in, are nuns in the N-O-N-E sense. But I'm not surprised that you have, there's a core of believers and clergy who see their task as primarily service as well. You know, people and societies and civilizations go through crises of faith. I don't think we're going through a crisis of service right now. I think I want to separate out the question. I think also, just going back to some of the discussion here in terms of the relation between the nuns and the faith community, that to many of the young nuns, the perceived politicization of religion over the last 20 years has been a complete turnoff. I think perhaps we'll look back at Pope Francis and see in him a way in which people see the service component of religion as an antidote to that.
Anyone else? I believe the data make your point on this. I mean, Bob Putnam, who addressed us at the beginning of this meeting, and David Campbell are quite clear that there is a pulling back from moderate to progressive Christians because of the move to the right, and Francis would seem to be an antidote to that.
But the argument from the right in the culture wars, which in some issues has been unpersuasive, they're really going to have to rethink the way they're making that argument to a society where the nuns are a bigger share. Yes. Just doing the same thing you were doing in the 70s and 80s into the 10s and the 20s is just going to look nutty, frankly, when more people are going to say, a bigger portion of the population is going to say, well, because St. Paul said it is not an argument that cuts much ice with me. I'm sorry.
Although to speak in defense of a position that's not my own, I think they would argue back quite clearly, better to preserve the faith in its real form, even if we lose some people in the process, than to make a series of accommodations that dilute the faith.
Oh, no, I'm not suggesting making accommodation. I'm saying you've got to find another way to make your argument than St. Paul said it.
Right.
And I like St. Paul, don't get me wrong.
He was a friend of yours.
But I'm not going to say that arguing his position to an atheist is going to be very persuasive. Right?
Immediate confirmation.
Actually, St. Paul was quite effective with atheists, but go ahead.
Just my observation of the evangelical right,
Yeah.
and the evangelicalism has its center and its left also, but I'm seeing a generational change there.
Yes.
And so I'm thinking we are going to be hearing different arguments and arguments about different issues and advocacy for different issues. So it's happening.
I think the story of young evangelicals has not been told.
Yeah, I
it
agree
is
with that.
absolutely fascinating. It is going to not just change evangelicalism, but to the question, what has fundamentally shifted is the entry point that many people have to their tradition. And this is another way the world has changed. Absolutely. Previously the entry point was you were born into a family that went to church every Sunday, that had maybe gone to the same church for generations. You inherited faith. Religious identity now is fluid and growing ever more fluid. So this is a challenge for the church to rise to. And in my mind, if the entry point is a passion for service as opposed to something you inherited, that's a world I'd like to live in. But again, the traditions have this great, potentially redemptive challenge of then entering in and transmitting the fullness beyond that entry point.
The gentleman here and then the lady right next to him. Why don't I take both of you together if you wouldn't object to that? Go ahead.
My name is Ethan Chess. I'm a senior at Georgetown and a former student of Professor Dion's. So my question has to do, I guess, with the historical development and after World War II of media. Today, there is no Cronkite. Brian Williams is not Walter Cronkite, and he doesn't necessarily have that stature. And probably a better analog would be Murrow. There's no Murrow out there. So the question is, what does a more fragmented media, a media that doesn't have the same kind of trust relationship with the American people sitting down every night to, watch the news, how does that contribute to the media's ability to participate in the conversation about common good? Is the media better equipped now because of the way it's structured, or is it worse equipped than it was 50 years ago to work on some of these questions of common good? We live in an era, I think, that's very mistrustful of institutions, and the media, just like the church, is one of them.
The breathtaking advances in the tools that we have to work with in a very short amount of time has allowed my profession to tell more stories about more things in a more profound way than ever before, and we're doing it to fewer people in a bigger country. So that's not a good set of momentum plays for us. To win the May book, that is the spring ratings period for the 3 nightly news programs in the United States, you used to need 21, 22 million viewers. Today you can win the May book with 9 in a country with 100 million more adults than when you used to win the May book with 22 million viewers. So what we've lost is convening power, along with authority. There's a tremendous crisis of authority, but we also don't have convening power. And I think those things also are related to each other. They move down the same track.
Just to amplify on that a little more, when CBS News with Walter Cronkite covered the dogs being set on civil rights demonstrators in Alabama, or when Cronkite, after the Tet Offensive, got on the air and said, look, I don't think this is a war we're winning, those became part of the lingua franca of the country. We don't have this is common ground. We don't have a lingua franca anymore. And what I see on MSNBC is not what I see on Fox, although as I mentioned to Ray before we convened, I mainly watch Turner Classic Movies. With the shrinking audience comes a shrinking authority, and to a certain degree, vice versa.
Just Krista or David, a crisis of authority. Boy, is that a conversation you hear about the churches, our Catholic Church, a lot. Link these up if you care to, or if one of you would. Because I do think there is a crisis of authority in the society. By the way, you proved why all teachers always speak with pride about their great students. Thank you for the question.
I mean, I would say we are redefining the meaning of authority now, just like we're redefining the meaning of community. But technology has changed this for as much as anything, and we can't possibly have privileged voices of authority anymore the way we could when there were 3 TV channels. I would, though, like to put in a good word for the internet. Yes. Because, Ray, I mean, a lot of that good content you're creating, that extra content, it's not all on the weekly, it's not all on the nightly broadcast. And,
that's why I gave it its props right at the beginning. We can tell more stories about
you can
more
tell,
things and in more depth all the time.
And in different places. And, for my show, a radio show, we will very soon have more listeners by podcast than we do by radio. And the exciting thing, and this is the upside of technology we don't talk about. Yes, it creates echo chambers, absolutely. But it also does create a potential for unexpected, unlikely combinations of people together in a digital space who less and less are together in our physical spaces. And that's what we're seeing with our audience. And the other thing that the digital, of course, we all know the story about how technology has fundamentally challenged the business model, in particular of newspapers. But I think that technology can also be a force in bringing journalists back to their public service heart. Something completely new now is that where it used to be that a story ended the day it was published in the newspaper. The story can begin now the day it's published in the newspaper. I think especially newspaper people will be the first to tell you, well, even Huffington Post would tell you that they haven't figured out how to do anything that's not toxic with comment sections. I mean, that's a challenge. But interaction with the community and on, a stake in and participation in the impact of a story is possible in a way that was never possible before. And that's good news.
The comments are fascinating under anything you write. I have always liked when I got, "Dear Mr. Dion, are you as dumb in person?" And so the good thing about that is you all can answer that question now for yourself. But the lady over here, and then John Borelli wanted to come in. Please.
Hi, Diana Owen from Georgetown University, and actually you kind of answered the question before I was able to ask it about the digital world and basically using new media for the common good, because I basically see the good, see the kinds of trends that you're talking about, but I often find that those are drowned out by the kind of vitriolic comments and the fact that the public space, the digital space, is being used more to vent and to not to come to any kind of a common discussion or a sense of the common good. And frankly, I appreciate this panel. I guess this is the 3rd day of the conference now. I've been kind of puzzling over the whole issue of what really is the common good, and have kind of come to the conclusion that we are so fragmented, that echo chambers are so prevalent that it's really difficult to come to that, and and that's a problem that we need to address. But I see in the digital age that this issue of coming to a sense of a common good is really just more difficult and problematic, because so many voices are allowed to kind of express themselves. That's great, but in a free-for-all sense, often anonymous, that allows for I think, less consensus building and true discourse and just a lot of venting. And what's especially troubling to me is that these kinds of rants become the sources for, news organizations that no longer are, kind of employing real journalists anymore.
Comments on that. I just, if I could say, there's something about the yelling back at the media that I am very torn about, because there is a sense in which these things look like rants. They are not, rooted in reason. They are sometimes obscene. And yet, there is the sort of small d Democrat in me says, I'm really glad everybody can yell back at us. What right do I, if I have a right to express a view, folks out there have every right to yell back at me, even if they're not very polite about it. But I'm not sure where it takes the discourse. It's actually better to have somebody yell at you with a reasoned argument. But maybe that's a bias on my part. But take that question and let me sort of append a second one, which is the whole issue of whether fragmentation and polarization is being caused by media, or whether the fragmentation and polarization preceded these developments in the media, and these new technologies are amplifying what was already happening. But take the general comment that I thought it was a great comment. If you could take sort of those together. Anyone want to?
Well, not that long ago, politicians, policymakers, and persuaders talked to you through us. Now they have their own lines of communication to you. They don't need us, which is fine in some cases, but not fine when they're telling you things that just ain't so. So at the end, when we get, for instance, to the 4th year of the Affordable Care Act, it finally all goes into effect, and large portions of the population still have no idea how the law works, what it's meant to accomplish, who lives under its umbrella, who doesn't. It's an indictment of the business. I feel bad about that because we should have done a better job of explaining it. But it's also, I think, a sign that there were other people out there while I was talking to you about it, telling you that I was lying, or telling you the opposite of what I was saying about how it worked. I went on to a social media site after the first couple of weeks of the rollout, when things were not going well, and somebody says, oh boy, the White House just announced they did 500,000 people. Well, at that rate, it's going to take 50 years to sign everybody up. Failing to understand that not all 300 million Americans had to do anything. That the Affordable Care Act, in fact, didn't affect the vast, vast majority of them who already had insurance and already had it through their jobs. He thought that A, he was against it, and B, it affected him somehow, even though he had an insurance policy from where he worked. So when I saw that, my heart sank, because I thought, all right, this guy is a little bit of a knucklehead, but if we've done such a bad job over the first 3 years of this, that he still thinks that all 300 million of us have to go onto a website and do something, then we haven't been heard over the din. We haven't managed to stick out as a place of good information when all this bad information is being distributed. And I don't say that as someone who's a particular supporter or detractor of the Affordable Care Act. I'm just using it as an example of a highly contentious issue recently in the public sphere for debate, where at the end of the process, the public, in a vast way, still didn't understand how this thing worked.
The truth is very much coded red and blue now to a degree that I cannot remember. Harold, you were...
Yeah, but even, I don't think Roger Ailes, the guiding genius of Fox News, thought he was taking a huge risk when he constructed Fox News the way it's turned out to be. I think the media in their current diffusion do augment the differences and do collectively, because they're putting out different stories, as Ray said, lead to very differing perceptions of what the facts are, never mind the opinions. But the divisions are very real and predate this. It just is I think some of those opinions and some of those misconstrued facts didn't get as wide a play as they get today. But we've always been a country bitterly divided by race. In many ways, that's moderated, but in other ways, the divisions are still very real and very fierce. We've been a country, I think we need to say this, in which, as we talk about the erosion of the perspective of the common good, we need to talk about the erosion of the middle class and the heightening of class differences in this country. There's been stunning data that show the percentage of Americans who describe themselves as middle class, sort of, your default position as an American in a certain sense, has declined dramatically over the last decade. These divisions are real. The media collectively, I think, exacerbate them. But it's a bit of a chicken and egg question. I don't think you could say the media are primarily causal, but they certainly add to the cacophony.
John?
Yes, thank you, E.J. I'm struck by your responses to the first question and how varied your understandings are on the common good. And what worries me is yesterday one of our speakers, Saba Mahmood from University of California, Berkeley, talked about how it's not enough to have laws. We have to have some kind of common understanding. And she also worried about the great privatization that's going on in societies, Medicare and Social Security, and that's creating less and less a sense of our. So if the common good is, and you all are journalists who respect religious views and respect religious institutions. So in many ways, I wonder how representative you are of the profession. But is even a common understanding possible? And what role would the media play in that?
A common understanding of the common good?
Yes.
Krista?
We don't have a common understanding of the common good right now, and we can't force it, right? So the work we have to do now is figuring out how we have to figure out how to relate to each other in difference, as we are different and as we disagree, before we can ever hope to get back to a place, if indeed there ever was one, where we have a common understanding of the common good. But as Americans, we're goal-oriented, and we don't want anything to take very much time, and we drive to resolution. We get on the same page, we call the debate, we take a vote. But this issue of how we relate to each other in this changed world, even while we hold difference, I like to use this phrase of Rilke, how we, our question is overshadowed and defined. Our age is defined by questions, outstanding questions, and we have to figure out how to live those questions together. And so that's work of relationship. Now, I want to say that our traditions are our great, vast repositories of wisdom about human relationship, not just about God, but about who we are to each other. And so, again, this is a challenge I want to call out for the traditions to mine what they know about the other and offer that up to the 21st century.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of threads that have hinted in a certain direction, but we haven't really articulated it. And when you talk about the other, I'm also thinking we need to talk about the marginalized. And Harold was kind of talking about class gap and so forth. I think our job as journalists often is telling people about the people who are invisible to them.
Exactly.
So one of my favorite Chicago journalists was Studs Terkel. He and I didn't share politics, but I loved what he did because he kept opening my eyes to the existence of people and people's lives that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. And that's an extremely important thing for us to be doing. The common good is not going to be served if it's some sort of middle. Common good has to include margins.
And I think that's very much what Brian Hare said yesterday. In fact, one of the questions I was going to ask is, there is the old line, and I've forgotten who said it, that the job of the journalist is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, which is, in a sense, the preferential option for the poor.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out the erosion of the common good takes place institutionally in this nation all the time. The notion, when we talked about the stable faith communities, you grew up, this was your religion, you went to that church every Sunday. In a past America, people had loyalty to their companies, their employers had loyalty to them. That's an element of the social contract which has been shredded largely by the employers. The dominant American corporations, you assumed were in certain sense American. That seems increasingly a notion that's in question. They think of themselves as global. There's a lot of shredding of the common good that exists in that institutional economic context, which I think affects us in ways that are both obvious and not so obvious.
I thank you for that. And one sentence, and then I want to go to several questions at once to make sure we get the voices in, starting over there. But I think now there is a need for those who believe in the common good to actually make a case that it exists. And I think that may have been always true to some degree, but I think there's suspicion of the common good as an idea that some might see it as sort of socialist, or some might see it as an excessive attack on individualism from some other direction. I've noticed over the years that President DeJoy and I are very fond of the same line from the same philosopher, which is Mike Sandel's line: when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. I think that's common sense, but I know a whole lot of other people don't think that's common sense at all. I am right that you were fond of that, right, Jack? Yes, I can't misquote your president. Back here, over here, is that still Congressman Moran there?
It is, but I want to defer to some of these folks who haven't had the chance.
Okay, and then we'll get you in. Let's have several voices at once here. Go ahead.
Ambassador Diaz from soon-to-be John Kearney Murray Chair at Loyola University in Chicago. I just
One
wanted
of the best titles ever, by the way.
Isn't that great? I just wanted to, Krista Tippett, you've been a great fan all my life. In fact, all my kids, all 4 kids, were basically forced to listen to your show, speaking of faith. So, but I just wanted to, I was wondering, one of the things that happened to me when I became ambassador, coming from the academic world to the world of sound bites in the media, is what does this culture that works in 24-hour cycle in the soundbite? You've changed your name of the show to On Being Human. How do you explain or articulate the complexity of the human condition in a soundbite, which we seem to be, and I'm in the Twitter world, so I tweet, but I have to think 300, I have to think extra carefully in terms of what kind of words do I want to say that will communicate the depth of the situation that oftentimes cannot be communicated in so many words. So for any of you, Ray Suarez too, you were part of the family's evening routine. But can you speak to the culture of the soundbite, and how do we try to articulate the kinds of issues that we are facing as a human family in this kind of culture? So
hey, can you hang on? But you definitely have the first dibs in honor of his family. That was wonderful. Up here, this colleague.
Marilyn McMahon, Georgetown University. We began by how we're failing our young people. And you not only speak, you hear from many sectors of our society. You've mentioned some of the ways that we're failing our young people and the nuns. You've mentioned too tight borders. You've mentioned not being aware enough of the need for new entry points. You've mentioned that there are parts of our community that are invisible. I'm just wondering if there's any other input you're getting from our young people about how mainline religious institutions might be failing them.
All right, I want to say 3 sound bites in defense of sound bites, by the way. All men are created equal. God is love. Do unto others as they do unto you. That we confuse, sometimes I think we confuse sound bites as we create a general evil, when in fact, I have a dream. There are really quite excellent historical sound bites. But Krista, I want you to take that, and then we'll go around and
want me to? Okay.
Start with your
Well,
fan.
you can't get at the depth and nuance of anything in a soundbite. I'll say something about Twitter in a minute. But and so we have to have, those of us who can create places where there's deep, long conversation have to do that, and you can do that too. So we need both. But I will also say, I resisted Twitter for a long time, and I don't write that much, but you can be absolutely profound and poetic in 140 characters, and it's a good discipline. I was at something with Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of Great Britain. Everything that came out of his mouth was 140 characters. And you're right, Jesus would have been great on Twitter. It's true.
Anyone else on either point?
Well, just to say that people who speak on behalf of institutions to reporters very often avoid anything quotable.
Yeah.
And so reporters are often looking for just that one sentence, please, one sentence that I can actually quote that isn't fog,
It's one of my favorite news conferences. Governor Kerry of New York back in the day was very back and forth for several questions. And the reporter finally said, "Now, Governor, I am totally confused." And Governor Kerry smiled and said, "Good." He said absolutely nothing quotable on the topic. Did you have a thought on these?
No, other than that was also Dwight Eisenhower's model of press conferences. No, I had nothing further to say.
You asked about the young people and the nuns toward the end. And when EJ mentioned earlier that, and Harold as well, that the percentage of the nuns among the youngest age groups is the highest, I think their formative years were the years in which the conflicts over religion and the conflicts over the politicization of religion were at their highest pitch. There's a tremendous branding problem now when you just take randomly selected groups of young voters and you give them terms to give associated words with, religious and Christian. The words are angry, judgmental, really pretty negative words. So it doesn't give you intolerant, doesn't give you much to build on. And my daughter, the seminarian, I hope her ears are burning up in New York, she had classmates in one of the finest universities on planet Earth constantly saying things to her like, "I can't believe you're religious, you're so smart." Which is very different from the post-war consensus where a lot of room was made for religious difference in the public sphere. Maybe privately you might think that what the guy over here believed was nuts, but you wouldn't say so.
Notice he pointed this way, by the way, toward me.
Well, over here, over here.
That's all right.
But you wouldn't say so because what was the content of polite social intercourse was that you made room for the other guy or gal in a public way, even while privately thinking that they really didn't have their share of the truth. So I think there's a very, very tough branding problem in the youngest age cohorts right now.
Now, I'm told by John that we're supposed to cut it off here. Let's do one. Two very brief questions. One over here, and Congressman Moran has hung around all this time, so he deserves a. And I'm not just referring to your congressional career. Go ahead.
Right, so you've all talked about the challenges of really reporting the news in an effective way, and you've also talked about Pope Francis, who I think has been someone who's done an amazing job at, so to speak, reporting the news of the gospel with today's media in such an effective and clear way. So what can his example sort of teach media in the U.S. and reporters in the U.S.?
That's a great question. And Congressman Moran, you've got a mic there. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is somewhat consistent, but it's a little longer question. I apologize for it. But I want to observe that I read Harold and you, EJ, religiously. And Harold, being a secular Jewish person, you're Catholic. Your message is the same. really. Very little difference. I listened to Ray's commentary, very consistent. Krista, likewise, and most of what's in Christianity today, David, is consistent as well. So I want to share a observation that a Jesuit theologian, professor of theology, shared with me. He did so almost surreptitiously, almost in a whisper. He said, you know, Jim, the body of Christ means the body of the faithful. What does that mean? He says, in other words, Christianity was meant to be the most genuine expression of democracy, even to a greater extent than democracy they had in Athens. And it was meant to be an evolution of Judaism. So he says, well, that means that if the majority, the body of the faithful, believe in liberation theology, or, more controversially, believe that women should have equal power and influence with men, or even more controversially, that they genuinely believe that contraception is acceptable, then that is what we as a church believe. And I said, well, that's radical, and it's really situational ethics. He says, no, it really isn't. Because our understanding of spirituality was meant to evolve. And our responsibility is to reflect upon the most basic teachings of Jesus and the other prophets. But the disciples were meant to explain those teachings as they applied to the common good. And he used that term. So they weren't meant to create a hierarchy. They were meant to be the interpreters, to help us better understand what it means to live a good life. And that's why I address this to you, because I think commentators, opinion makers, people such as yourselves may not fully understand the role that you have been playing in society. And even though it may only be 9 million now that watch, they are the opinion makers. They are the influencers. They are the ones that we look to for guidance. And this common good, I think, is it really is what you attempt to explain in your columns. You interpret what's happening in the world around us through the prism of spirituality, of trying to create a better world for all of us. And the question is, do you think that our spiritual beliefs were meant to evolve and to apply to the challenges that face us today? So, thank you.
Thank you. I want to warn everybody that there are people here from the Doctrinal Commission of the Church. Thank you so much. I just want to note. I want to note that first Congressman Moran assigned Georgetown responsibility for saving the Republic. Now he assigns columnists responsibility for saving the Republic. Some people might have more confidence in one of those than the other, but
you're under both.
That's true. Well, let's go right around, and I want to get to I'm going to close with something on Francis anyway. So bless you for that question. Can I? How did I start? I just want to reverse the order. Why don't I go Harold down to David?
Well, first of all, thank you, Congressman Moran. That's one of the both most charitable and gracious descriptions of what EJ and I do. I do share a commonality with EJ to the point that I had a Lyndon Johnson column ready to go yesterday. I opened the paper. EJ had already written it. So
had a great column.
that is an occasional peril of being having thought processes that, even though I am the secular Jew and EJ the Catholic, that somehow mysteriously come together more often than not. Though usually,
it's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering what it was. Okay, all right. I'm hesitant to say, I'm not the person up here who can address You know, if Pope Francis's example is going to lead the way for us in a restoration of faith. But I mean, what I do see out of Pope Francis, which echoes what I was saying earlier, is to the extent that and Krista was saying this too, to the extent that religion is identified with service, I think this does a great service to religion. And it's, I think, the one way back in a period where a great many young people have gone through the perception of religion that Ray described so well, the one way back to reach them. Now, I'm, as a secularist, I am ultimately not really concerned with the percentage of people who have faith and the percentage of people who don't. I'm greatly concerned with the percentage of people who have that ethos of service and want to devote some portion of their lives to making a good society. But I think that's the door that Pope Francis has opened, which I think would be a very good door for institutions and individuals to go through.
Thank you. Ray?
Well, we got all the way to the end of the panel before anybody brought up kerygma and didache, so I want to make sure we get to that before we finish. Pope Francis is lucky. He gets to be a preacher and a teacher. These guys are preachers. Most working reporters shouldn't be preachers. They should just be teachers. Yeah, he also gets to just tell good news by his job description. I'm fascinated because he's one of the great Rorschach blots of modern life. Yeah. Just in this last year and a couple of weeks since he became Pope, it's been fascinating watching the public reaction to the things that he's said. Some of it's been exciting and from unexpected quarters, and some of it's been just puzzling, as it's really more about defending turf and trying to rush into a vacuum left purposely by a man who wants you to think about what he just said to actually explain what he really meant. I think he's so I think it's good because it gets more people talking in a way that's hopeful and prospective about what someone who still has a pretty important pulpit has to say. I play in a different league, but I still watch what he says quite closely.
Can I just add that the Pope's writing on the economy was not simply, except in the most generic sense, a message of good news. It was a message that was a strong critique of where the global economy is headed. So and this actually, of course, is why I'm telling this to an audience of people who follow the church more closely than I is a mystery. But this is a through line that goes through the recent church and among popes who had nowhere near whatever it took to reach out to people like me. That's still a through line. So the good news from my point of view is heightened by the perception of the bad news that comes through in this Pope's work as well.
Thank you. Krista, David.
So kind of coming back to the opening question here about journalism and the common good, I think a question behind that is whether journalism has become disconnected from its essential impulse to be there for the common good. And I think that your generation, the asker of the question about Pope Francis, is very much committed to joining inner and outer life. And one of the words that you're bringing into our common life is this language of authenticity. And I think that is one thing that Pope Francis so embodies, right? That is good for all of us. And it's the language of joining inner and it's the embodiment of joining inner and outer. And it's also the capacity to say, I've been wrong at times, right? I have to rethink this. Who am I to judge? I actually think this is connected to the notion of faith and evolution. I mean, faith has an evolutionary quality in every life, right? So even a person who has convictions of faith that they've held since as long as they could speak the words, someone who could say, I believe in God every day of their life, the connotations that holds, if you are breathing, is changing day by day and year by year. It's still true, And it is filled with, the meaning of it evolves and unfolds. And if that's true in the life of individuals, it's certainly true in our common life as well. And I think it's a good thing to pay attention to.
David?
Well, when Congressman Moran was talking, was he channeling John Henry Newman and development of doctrine? But there is a sense in which, yes, things change, and it is the sense of the faithful that helps to validate what's going on. And for those of us who are in religious journalism, tracking that is an extremely important thing for us to do, which means we need to be careful not to give platform to outliers who are just talking nonsense, but also to watch those shifts as they actually happen. It's a good function that we can perform.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, everyone. I want to say two very quick things to close. The first is, I think it is not insignificant that we are having this, we've had this three-day gathering about 2 weeks before Francis is going to create two saints, John the 23rd and John Paul II. And I think this is a remarkable event, partly because of the shrewdness that Francis is showing in bringing together a church which is quite divided, and that people who tend to think of themselves as John the 23rd Catholics often don't think of themselves as John Paul II Catholics or vice versa. But it's also an insight that actually one is essential to the other. It is my view that John Paul II's witness on behalf of religious liberty, human dignity, social justice would have been impossible without the witness of John the 23rd. And it is a sort of promising path in terms of the very kinds of discussions we've had in terms of the common good. And I will close because Harold brought up LBJ, and we're celebrating the Civil Rights Bill's enactment this week. One of LBJ's favorite lines was from Isaiah, and it was, "Come, let us reason together." And I do think that embodies the spirit of what we've tried to do here today and what so many people far smarter than I am tried to do over the last several days. So I just want to thank Krista and David and Ray and Harold and introduce our president, Jack DeGioia, who will close the event. Thank you all very much.
Give Ray a chance here. Well, again, just in closing, we began on Wednesday in gratitude, and we will close today in gratitude. On behalf of Georgetown and the Archdiocese of Washington and the Congregation on Culture, we're grateful for all of you for your presence here over the course of these past 3 days. You've deepened our collective understanding and strengthened the foundation for future conversations between all people of faith and goodwill. We have shared a wide range of experiences, the opening talk by Robert Putnam, the cultural event at the Kennedy Center, our conversations yesterday, our panels today, our cultural event last evening, Everything That Rises Must Converge, have provided us with a multiple range of perspectives. And I hope for each of you, you've been able to find a new way to connect to this conversation and to these sets of ideas. I appreciate many of you for your trust and confidence that you were willing to give a shot at the hip-hop conversation on Wednesday evening. For those who had some skepticism about it, I do have a 12-year-old son, and I can tell you it worked with that group. So, but we have had an opportunity to engage in academic conversation and personal reflection. We've sought to understand more deeply our responsibilities to each other and to the common good. I'm deeply grateful to Cardinal Ravasi and the Pontifical Council for Culture and Cardinal Wuerl and the Archdiocese of Washington. I also would like to express our deep gratitude to Dr. Billington and all of his colleagues here at the Library of Congress for the opportunity to spend time together in this, our nation's oldest, most venerable cultural institution. Jim, we're deeply grateful to you for that opportunity. And I'd wish to thank again Congressman Wolf and Congressman Moran, and our panelists this morning for the opportunity for us to continue this conversation in the way that we did.